welcome to today's event. We are going to start in 2 minutes. In the meantime, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat section. Where are you from? What are you currently studying? What are you up to? Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm Srishti from Rethinking Economics India Network, and it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to today's event. The Rethinking Economics India Network is a national network of the global Rethinking Economics movement. We operate as a nationwide ecosystem of stakeholders in the space of pluralist and heterodox economics. And we are looking to interface with individuals, academia, civil society, and other organizations in order to encourage teaching, learning, and discussion for scaling collaborative efforts towards a better, more inclusive economics for India and contribute towards the global movement at large. In case you want to learn more about a movement, you can check out the links that we post in the chat box below. For this session, we have amongst us Dr. Alex Thomas. Alex M. Thomas teaches economics at Azim Premji University. He studied economics at the University of Madras, Hyderabad, and Sydney. He published in several journals, including the Economic and Political Weekly, European Journal of History of Economic Thought, the Journal of Interdisciplinary Economics. His co-edited book, Pluralist Economics and Its History, was published by Routledge in 2019. His textbook, Macroeconomics, an Introduction, published by Cambridge University Press, will be available for purchase in April 2021. We welcome you, sir. Thank you for joining us today. General housekeeping rules. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box below. There will be certain questions and it will be mostly an interactive session. So feel free to post your responses in the chat box. If you have any questions, you can type them down in the questions tab, and please make sure that you upvote the question that you like the most so that it is easy for us to choose from them. I now hand over the space to Dr. Alex Thomas.
Thank you so much, Srishti. Thank you, Vinayakan, and thank you, Amrita, and everyone else at Rethinking Economics India for having me here. So I'll start sharing the screen. Srishti, can you please enable screen sharing for me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Just let me know when it's enabled. Okay. Yeah, I think it works now. Okay. So I've titled this lecture "The Merits of Pluralism in Economics." I've spoken about this in multiple ways, and I think over time I've come to this kind of model of engagement, which I feel is much more interactive in nature, and I found that to be most interesting for me as a speaker, and perhaps for those in the audience as well. I'll just in terms of the outline, what I'm going to do today is I'll talk a little bit about the origins of the lecture. Then I'll start off by asking what is economics. Within that, I'm going to discuss the questions of value, distribution, output, growth. Those are the four key things. Then I'll make some concluding comments, share some books, and I'll end with some questions for everyone in the audience. So I'm not really going to respond to those questions, but those are questions I think all of you can think about. So, in terms of origins of this lecture, and given that I know that at least within the Rethinking Economics group, many of you are students who are doing your undergraduation, post-graduation in various colleges and universities in India, I thought I'll share a little bit of my own journey. And the origins of this lecture also goes that way. It was when I was doing my master's at the University of Hyderabad, and subsequently I've tried to engage with these questions at various platforms. Some of them, as you can see, the Student Economist or the Economics Periodical, they were published by the students and their student journals mainly. And in 2012, when there was a walkout at Harvard University, some of us who were classmates from the University of Hyderabad decided to write a letter. It was called Heterodox Economics and published in the Economic and Political Weekly. I've tried to engage with this question also in 2016 in that article called Unlearning Economics, which was mainly addressed to school teachers. Teacher Plus is a magazine which is mainly addressing school teaching. Subsequently, in 2017-18, my colleague Rahul De and we had organized a workshop where we invited many teachers from colleges, from schools, from universities within India to come together and to discuss what were the issues in undergraduate economics education. And this was later published as Rethinking Undergraduate Economics Education in 2018. And recently, I wrote an extremely short piece. I mean, it's less than 1,000 words, called "The Merits of Pluralism in Economics" for a more general audience. So, what I'm going to talk about today brings forth some of these concerns that I've been thinking about now for over a decade. And I want to begin by asking this question and getting responses from you, because I think that it is the definition of economics in a way which allows us to talk about pluralism. So if I mean, I will take about maybe 3 or 4 responses from you and then move on. So if some of you can put it in the chat, or Srishti, if they can unmute themselves and speak, that's also welcome.
All right, so if anyone wants me to unmute them, I can do that. Otherwise, please feel free to put in your responses in the chat box below.
Okay, so there's one response that has come, which is that it's a management of resources. Okay, so I'll wait for, at least 3 more responses before I move on.
I think it's the study of meeting there are so many resources, unlimited resources, and unlimited needs are also there. So it's a study to combine how to get the maximum from both sides.
Okay. So there are unlimited resources and unlimited wants, sort of, and how do we, combine them in some way? Okay, I think that so we've got enough responses. Somebody has also mentioned ends and scarce means, which is a similar kind of idea to usage of resources. how to efficiently use scarce resources. Someone has also mentioned it is understanding the relationship between production and distribution. There's also a response about financial transactions, utilization of resources for production, etc. All right. So I'm not going to respond to what is economics at the moment. I'm just going to hold on to. I've just made a note of what some of you have said here, but largely there seems to be one kind of definition which is coming up, which is that you have unlimited resources, or you have some kind of limited resources, and you have certain needs that you need, needs that you have, and you're trying to allocate these ends and means. So now let me go on to microeconomics, and the way in which I'm understanding microeconomics is that one of the questions that microeconomics tries to answer, or should try to answer, is what determines prices. And this traditionally has been called the theory of value. The other question that microeconomics tries to determine is what determines or explain is wages and profits. And this, again, in the past has been called the theory of functional income distribution. So if you take a microeconomics textbook, I mean, they're not really going to write the theory of value or theory of income distribution, but usually the chapters go from producer theory, consumer theory, and then it is brought together in supply and demand. And you have an equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. But ultimately, it is an explanation for equilibrium prices. Now, moving on to the question, macroeconomics broadly, one of the questions that it asks is what determines output and employment, aggregate output and employment. And this is often called the theory of output. Usually, the growth of output is not taught within macroeconomics, but for ease of presentation, I've just put it in macroeconomics. But the question of economic growth or the theory of economic growth also can fall within the subject matter of macroeconomics. So now let me get into the question of value. And here what I'll do is, just like I ask questions on how do you define economics, I'm going to ask certain questions based on some kind of data. Right? So this is a question of value or the question of prices. So here, this data, it's not my data or anything, but what I want you to do is, I want you to tell me from this piece of empirical fact that I have presented to you, what do you think is driving prices, or what do you think is driving inflation? If I can get about 3 responses, I think that'll be good. I'll repeat the question again. What do you think, I mean, in this case, between 2018 or 2019, what is the link between, let's say, prices and inflation? And here we see that anyway, inflation is rising. And what are your thoughts on it? So you can feel free to share your thoughts on this. Okay, so there's one response which is too much money chasing too few goods. There's another answer which is about money supply. There's another answer which is about crude oil prices. Okay, and I'll take one more, which is that it could also be some kind of a rise in demand. Okay, so I want you to just hold on to at least these 4 things which have come up. One is too much money chasing too few goods, or it could be an increase in money supply, it could be crude oil price increase, or it could be some sort of a rise in demand. And this is based on what you know so far. Hold on to that, and let me move to the next one. This is again data on incremental capital output ratio. So the units of capital that is required to produce a unit of output, and the link between that, and of course the title is there, growth. But if you can tell, how do you think what do you think is the relevance of capital output ratio? Can you see some link between capital output ratio and prices? That is the more precise question that I'm going to pose. I'll repeat that question. What do you think is the link between capital output ratio and prices? Again, I'll take about 3 or 4 responses and then move on. Okay, one response is that there is an inverse relationship between the two. Okay, as in supply, again, inverse relationship between supply and prices. Okay. If capital by labor increases, then output increases in the next period and hence P decreases. Okay, so you're drawing some kind of a relationship between capital labor ratio Y and the aggregate price level. Okay, all right. Again, just hold on to that. One is that some kind of inverse relationship between supply and aggregate price level. Some kind of a relationship between capital labor ratio, output, and the price level. This is about, environmental performance. There's not much information here really. It's just the economic costs of air pollution as a share of GDP in 2018. What I want you to reflect on here is, what do you think is the link between, let's say, environmental performance or environmental accounting and prices? So I'll repeat that question again. How do you think about the economic costs of pollution or environmental pollution and the link between that and prices? Is there any connection? Okay, so one response is, as we use more environmental resources, the price declines and more pollution. Okay. So some connection between environmental prices. So the more manufacturing goods produced by a country, the more, then the damage to the environment. So some kind of, most people have spoken about environmental usage or environmental extraction having a decline in prices. The other kind of response has been that more pollution is internalized in costs and thus more prices. So pollution and prices, that link is something at least one can think about. Some of you have said that it increases, some of you have said that it decreases. Okay. So there's a question about these percentages. So Rajesh, for this at least session, the details of the percentages are not important. I'm just asking you to reflect on really environmental issues or environmental concerns and prices. So the specific details themselves are not so central to what I want to say. Okay. So now let me just put forth these things. In the beginning, when I asked the question about what is economics, I think most of you gave the definition, which I think all of them were very similar, except for one, which I think was different, which was a link between production and consumption. That was the only different definition. Now, my claim is that there are not just a single theory of value or prices, as we would think if we only read the standard microeconomics textbook that we study, but rather that there are multiple theories of value and prices. And here I'm just going to introduce you to a different one. So the first is the most well-known, which is what all of us study, which is the subjective theory of value. And ultimately, value is represented by utility, or more specifically, marginal utility. Right? So in equilibrium, what we have is P1 by P2 equals MU1 by MU2. So marginal utility, prices are proportional to marginal utilities. This is the subjective theory of value. It is called subjective theory of value because ultimately utility is a subjective measure. Now there is what is called objective theories of value. Objective only in the sense that they are not psychologically determined as utility is, but they have some other basis. So one of them could be the land theory of value. In fact, this is to be found in works of economists who were writing before Adam Smith, especially in Physiocrats, or some version of it in Physiocrats, and even before in William Petty. So land was considered, or one had what would be called a land theory of value. Labor theory of value is most popular because of Marx's work, but even before Marx, people had different kind of labor theories of value. You can even think of a land and labor theory of value. In fact, something like this is found in the work of Richard Cantillon, who published his economics text in 1755, so before Adam Smith. Right? So one is the subjective theory of value, which is what is the dominant understanding of value. And then you also have objective theories of value, which are generally not, at least most students are not exposed to these. Now, what I want you to what I will do next is, depending on your theory of value that you have been taught or it how you explain the three charts actually differs. And so if you have a land theory of value versus utility of theory of value, there are implications for how you understand the empirical data that I shared with you. So let me just get into the empirics of value now that I've covered the theories of value. And what I want to reflect on here is the link between theory, empirics, or accounting in some ways, and policy. Right? So I'm just going to make some general points here and not get into specifics of things, but to highlight how these are interconnected. Starting with prices. So most of you mentioned that about prices, at least it's caused by too much money or too much money supply. It could be rise in demand or crude oil prices. Right? So the question of what determines prices, is it determined by objective theory of value or is it subjective theory of value, has an implication for the formulation of an inflation policy. So so the question that you can try to ask yourself, I'm not going to give you the answer, is what does Reserve Bank of India believe in? Does it believe in the subjective theory of value or the objective theory of value? And therefore, how do they formulate their inflation policies? In India, we have the Competition Commission of India. What kind of value theory or price theory do they endorse? And if you were in their position and if you adopted a different value theory, would there be a difference in the way the competition policy is outlined? Now, let me get into quantities a little bit. What I mean by capital theory here is nothing but the measurement of capital. And I think most of you might be familiar with the aggregate production function. And the question is, how do you measure capital? Labor can be measured in terms of number of hours or number of days, but capital, because it's a heterogeneous bundle of commodities, it requires prices. And again, so the question is, how are these prices determined? Is it subjective theory of value or objective theory of value? Depending on how prices are determined or prices are accounted for or prices are explained, it has an impact on how you account or measure the capital output ratio, or the incremental capital output ratio, which is often used for policy purposes. Also, how industrial policy is formulated. Okay, I'll just wait here because I think there are some questions which are coming up in chat. I'll just. Okay, it's not, no questions. All right. So the third point, so this is just to reply or respond to some of the points that was made earlier, but as we go along, I'll give a little more clarity on what I think about these things. So in terms of ecological questions, if we want to have a green GDP, which takes into account ecological factors, William Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize, if you look at the kind of value theory that is embedded in Nordhaus, it's very clearly, it is a subjective theory of value or a utility theory of value. So there is a problem, or ecologists would argue that how do you price or how do you value non-renewable resources? And can economists really actually value them? So this was, I thought that I'll just use what I had written because that's much more precise than what I'm saying. So the question that I want to again leave you with is, can we not have a land theory of value or a land and labor theory of value? If we have such a price theory which underpins our economics, will this not enable a better accounting of our ecological use or misuse? So this is also a question that I want you to think about. Now let me move to the question of distribution, income distribution, the second component of microeconomics. And again, so this is minimum wages. This is minimum wages for unskilled workers. Again, the reason I'm showing you these charts is not because I'm not interested in the specifics of, what is the level of wages, etc. But it's just for us to have a platform and for you to respond to what I'm asking. So here, the question that I would ask you is, what do you think determines minimum wages? So again, I'll repeat the question. What do you think determines wages or minimum wages? Again, I'll take about 3 or 4 responses.
Central government delegate they are
Quality of work.
I think it is determined by the place where the labor is living. It's like the place. It's deprived area or the areas like Delhi.
But when you say place, what do you have in mind? What feature or characteristic of the place is important?
Okay, the place that like the areas like Delhi or the metropolitan cities, here unskilled labor will get the chances because there is a demand for work and there is a supply. So they get the market to work. But
Okay.
the areas like Bihar or the eastern UP, there is no, people are not demanding, so there are less industries, so there less demand for the labor, so they are not getting paid as much.
Okay. Yeah, got it. All right. So I've got broadly three responses. One is wages are determined by the quality of work, some kind of standard of living, or the demand for labor. Okay, there's other responses as well. Wage contract, per cap income, subsistence. Okay, all right. So this is about wage inequalities. Let's not talk. Let's not talk about the urban-rural issue for now. But what do you think explains the difference in wages between males and females? culture, labor law, education, discrimination. Okay, okay. Okay. So I think that patriarchy, discrimination, etc., sort of can be brought under one heading. Okay. Okay. So it is interesting. I mean, it's interesting. I'm just make a reflection or a comment, which is that in the previous question, when I had asked what determines wages, many of you mentioned quality of work, standard of living, and demand for labor. But when I asked about the difference between wages in males and females, surprisingly, none of you mentioned those factors. But anyway, we'll come to that. This is the question of education. Again, I mean, this is just, it's showing how India's enrollment levels are much worse after primary school, especially if you look at higher education. And the question that I have here is, what do you think is the link between education and wages? Okay, so link between education and positive relationship. Okay. Someone skilled, some kind of a signal. Okay. Skilled labor. Okay. All right. So now let me move. I think there's one more response. Generally, higher levels of education in higher hourly wage. Okay. All right. Again, like in the theories of, I mean, when I mentioned that there's not just a single theory of value or theory of price, as most standard textbooks of microeconomics tell us. Similarly, there are multiple theories of income distribution, and again, I'm going to provide you with an alternative one. The first is the marginalist approach. It is called marginalist approach because in this approach, all kind of reasoning is based at the margin. So you talk of marginal utility, you talk of marginal product, you talk of marginal revenue, like all these kinds of, it's about the reasoning. You are interested in knowing what happens at the margin. And so that's why I'm calling it the marginalist approach, to give it much more, some sort of precision. This makes use of the supply and demand idea, the general graphs that you see in your microeconomics book. So this is common. The other thing the marginalist approach adopts is the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, more specifically. Right? So which tells us that under conditions of equilibrium, in perfect competition, your wage equals the marginal product of labor and profit equals the marginal product of capital. In a way, you can say that the income distribution, in this case, let's just talk about wages. Wages are completely determined endogenously. That is, within the labor market or within the economic model, wages are being determined. That's why it is also called an endogenous theory of income distribution. But this is just one way of understanding it. And in fact, some of the things that you mentioned, which could be demand for labor or any other kinds of skills, etc., all fall within this kind of a way of looking at income distribution. This is the classical approach. I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by classical approach, where they argue that wages are determined because of customs and because of our understanding of subsistence. In other words, wages are determined by past politics and policies. Wages are determined by present politics and policies. And this is there particularly in Ricardo and Marx, that there is an inverse relationship between the wage rate and the rate of profit. In other words, there is some kind of a distributional conflict between workers and employers. Now, if you look at the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, what you notice is a harmonious existence of workers and capitalists, because wages are determined by marginal product of labor and rate of profit is determined by the marginal product of capital. So it's a harmonious account of income distribution, whereas in the classical approach, what you notice is there is an inverse relationship or a conflict between wages and profits. Another way in which this is different is that there is no attempt to reduce wages to a completely formalized model. And the idea is that it is because too many factors affect it. And I think many of you mentioned it: culture, patriarchy, discrimination. All of these are factors which cannot really be brought down to demand and supply curves. These cannot be brought down to marginal product of labor. And so, for the classical economists or people who adopt the classical approach, they suggest that income distribution is largely exogenous and not determined within the market. So let me just spend a little more time talking about what I mean by marginalist economics. I must start by saying that what all of us learn generally in school, college, higher education, and PhD is marginalist economics, and this is the dominant paradigm. It is often called neoclassical economics, and I'm not using the word neoclassical because it encompasses a lot more than strictly what I call marginalist economics. Another reason for not using it is because it seems to convey the idea that neoclassical is somewhat neo or an advance over classical, which is not really the case. And one of the things that I would like to convey with this lecture is also to indicate that they are different, they're distinct. And this kind of nomenclature of neoclassical suggests a linear progression, which is not really there, as I'll make clear in the course of the rest of the presentation. It starts off by assuming a Robinson Crusoe. You talk of the individual and then you aggregate. And this, in the literature, sometimes it's called methodological individualism. This is another way of characterizing marginalist economics. Some of the people who have been associated with it in the past, and many of these ideas continue to be taught in microeconomics courses. Maybe their names are not mentioned, but their ideas still are. So Jevons, Walras, Marshall, Pigou. And as I mentioned, I didn't mention it very explicitly, but the subjective theory of value or the utility theory of value is what marginalist economics believe in. And this is their fundamental theory of value, right? That it is ultimately determined by marginal utility. Now, what is classical economics or classical political economy? In a way, actually, I should mention this one more thing, because to come back to the question of definition, which is that marginalist economics sees economics as a science of choice. It is a science of choice or a science of allocation, where you have limited resources and unlimited wants. So how do you allocate these resources? Right? So it's fundamentally a science of choice or a science of allocation, which is why optimization is so important for marginalist economics. Now, what is classical political economy? I would say that it's more interested in it's asking the question of production, distribution, consumption of commodities. And by commodities, I'm also referring to services. Classical political economy begins with social classes. They recognize that there is some sort of a uniformity between where people are placed, whether you're a worker or an employer, and that is significant and that has to be recognized, or for that matter, whether you are a landowner or a rentier. So you can think of the rentier class, the capitalist class, or the employer class, and the working class. Some of the people who have, in the past have worked in this tradition would be Kenne, the physiocrat, Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Piero Sraffa. And all of them in some ways, well, not really Sraffa, but all the others have some kind of labor theory of value. But at least Sraffa included, all of them reject the utility theory of value. So for none of them are they going to say that value is determined by utility. At this point, often, in class also students get confused if they have studied macroeconomics textbooks, because in macroeconomics textbooks, the first few chapters are about classical economics, and then you talk about Keynesian economics. Right? So Keynes's definition of classical economics, the problem, and that is what is followed by most textbooks, is that it's analytically deficient or incorrect. Because what Keynes does in his general theory is to call everybody before Keynes a classical economist. Although his main adversaries were Marshall and Pigou, and maybe to some extent Ricardo, but primarily he was challenging the economics of Arthur Pigou and Alfred Marshall. So, so don't get confused that because in macroeconomics textbooks, classical economics is seen as something else. And actually in macroeconomics textbooks, in the name of classical economics, what you really have is a kind of marginalist economics. So we are sort of rejecting Keynes's definition of classical economics and macroeconomics textbooks, which use this kind of a definition. Now let me move to output and employment. So again, let me ask the question of what do you think is the role of savings in determining output and employment? Or how do you think savings can help? Or do you think savings can help in increasing output or in determining output and employment? Again, I'll take about 3 or 4 responses and then move on. So I'll repeat it. Okay. Saving have to be invested but not hoarded. Okay. Savings leads to reduction of employment. Okay. Yeah. Any other responses? Maybe I'll wait for one more response.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just also posted my answer. It depends upon how you are using your saving. If you are going to invest it, it is in the circulation of the income flow, then it is going to help the GDP and the economy. But if it is hoarded for the purpose like for extingency and all, then it's of no use, then it will affect adversely the GDP and the economy.
Okay. All right. So somebody has also made a point about the effects of saving on short run and long run. And also that, okay, how savings are inversely related. Okay. All right. I'll come back to it. So again, just like I spoke about theories of value, theories of income distribution, we have theories of output and employment too. So the marginalist approach says this. In some ways, it believes in the Say's law, which says that whatever or supply creates its own demand. Right? Whatever is supplied will find its demand. The more precise way of formulating it in a two-sector economy or two-sector model with firms and households is the following. It says that if there's an increase in savings, it leads to a decrease in the rate of interest, and it leads to an increase in investment, right? And the rate of interest is what equilibrates planned saving and planned investment. Okay, so the rate of interest is the equilibrating mechanism, and if you have more savings, it is actually good for the economy. The other kind of implication of the marginalist approach is that there's a tendency to full employment in this approach. Now, let's take the Keynesian approach, which I think some of you mentioned, which is that it adopts the principle of effective demand, which says that it is really demand, aggregate demand, which determines aggregate output. And again, more specifically, if there is an increase in investment, it leads to an increase in aggregate output and income, which leads to an increase in planned saving. Right? So the direction of causation is different. The equilibrator between planned saving and investment is also different. Right? And finally, in the Keynesian approach, there is no tendency to full employment. So as you can see very clearly, when I'm talking about these different theories, they are, fundamentally different. One is saying there's a tendency to full employment. The other is saying there's no tendency to full employment. They're trying to explain the same variables. They're trying to explain the same economic phenomena, but their explanation is fundamentally different. So now let me move to, this is the last point, in terms of this asking you to respond, and then I'll make some concluding points. The question of economic growth. This is total factor productivity. Again, I want you to tell me what is the link between total factor productivity and growth. So total okay, for people who don't know what total factor productivity is, crudely put, one can think of total factor productivity as some measure of productivity which is not captured by within the aggregate production function, the L and K. So total factor productivity represents the A in the aggregate production function.
In my opinion, as the chart shows, it shows very like there is a very minimum correlation between the total factor productivity and the GDP growth of a country itself. So it determines that the GDP factors are not including precisely the factors that are affecting the total productivity. That the chart, as the chart shows.
Okay. So, all right. So that is one. That is just looking at the more empirical kind of response. So I think the two responses that are there in the chat box. One is that if there's an increase in total factor productivity, growth rate can be increased and sustained in long term. And again, so productivity or total factor productivity is positively related to economic growth. Okay. So now again, at the risk of saying it again, I'm going to talk about theories of economic growth, not just one kind of economic, one theory of economic growth. The dominant theory of economic growth that you will study generally in macroeconomics or in your growth theory is what is called the supply side growth theory, which is what Solo, if you study Solo, is based on. It's based on the aggregate production function, where you have, if you have a supply in labor or an increase in labor or increase in A, you're going to have an increase in output. Romer endogenized A or technology, but it's still supply side in nature. There is no aggregate demand efficiency problem, which is there in the supply side growth theories, effectively speaking. Now, the demand-led growth theories, there are some, I'm just going to mention the names, but essentially what the demand-led growth theories argue is that growth is determined by the growth of aggregate demand. And now this could be aggregate demand, which is brought about by government expenditure. It could be through exports. It could be through private investment, or it could be through private consumption. Right? But effectively speaking, growth happens because of growth in aggregate demand. And I've just mentioned some of the people who have work in this domain. And I've also put the title of a book cover here, or a photograph of the book cover here, which is a book written by Krishna Bharadwaj, who taught at JNU. And her book is called Classical Political Economy and Rise to Dominance of Supply and Demand Theories. And the reason I've mentioned this here is because if you're interested, I don't think it's available for purchase. If you have a copy of your library, should have it. Where she distinguishes, that I've also mentioned in the lecture, she doesn't really get into the supply side and demand-led growth theories, but the theories of value, theories of income distribution, she critically engages with it. And it's not very thick. I think it's a little over 100 pages or so. So I think that you can read it and finish reading the book actually. So now let me try to collate what I've said so far. And I'll just make one more point here, which is that the role of total factor productivity or technology or productivity in the demand-led growth theory, it is not straightforward. I mean, we cannot really say that productivity always leads to an increase in growth. We could have labor displacing effects, which has a negative impact on their consumption demand and therefore on aggregate consumption. So whether productivity or technological progress actually leads to economic growth is something that one needs to look at it more carefully and depends on the context. So there is no unequivocal relationship between A or total factor productivity and the growth of Y or output. So far we've spoken about two views, or you could call it two paradigms really. Uh, and some of you mentioned this when I asked the question of inflation. The mainstream view, or the dominant view, because you've been exposed to that, is that inflation is somehow caused by too much money or an increase in money supply, something like that, or some kind of an increase in demand. Whereas the alternative view is more to do with distributional issues, that is, between how wage contracts are set between employers and workers. And the alternative view also pays more attention to, let's say, prices of inputs like crude oil, which one of you mentioned. So, and the other point to remember is monetarism in a way assumes full employment, whereas in the alternative view, the economy is operating at less than full employment. The mainstream view says that aggregate employment, I mean, it's favorable. If you want to increase aggregate employment, you have to increase savings. Again, you can read the economic survey, you can look at the budget documents and see what, let's say, the Indian government thinks about these issues, and you'll be able to formulate your own answer. Say's law is sort of assumed in the mainstream view, which is that supply creates its own demand. Whereas in the alternative view, aggregate employment is determined fundamentally by investment. It could be private investment or government investment. And the person most well known for this is Keynes, although Kalecki, a Polish economist, also arrived at a very similar viewpoint. In the mainstream view or the marginalist view, wages are somehow determined by supply and demand. Whereas in the alternative view, wages are determined by history and culture. Now, this has an important role to play in policy making, because if wages are determined by history and culture, it means that automatically politics and policies become absolutely central to influence wages. But if people believe that wages are somehow determined by supply and demand only, then the focus to have appropriate or good policies and politics is not so strong. As we are nearing the end, I just want to share this quotation about why do some ideas become dominant, or why are some ideas more dominant than the other. And let me just read out this quote. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. So, I mean, I would not have asked this question, but simply because we are doing an interactive session, can Can anyone guess who, I mean, if you know, can anyone guess where this is from or who has written this? You can just put it in chat. Okay, yeah. So it is Marx. There is a question about other pluralistic economic thought. Maybe I'll take that towards the end in the Q&A session. Yeah, so this is taken from the German ideology. And the question that I would ask you is, what about our economic syllabi? That is there in schools, that is there in colleges, that is there in universities, that there is there in PhD programs. What design, what influences them, or who gets to decide what gets taught, right? And what is the role of students in that? What is the role of teachers in that? Where are these dominant ideas coming from? Moving, I mean, this is what I've tried to do in this presentation is, how do we make sense of our economic surroundings? I started by showing you some empirical fact or some kind of empirical information. And because of what you have studied through your conceptual knowledge, what kind of economics training you have received, your, your response to that same empirical information is different. In other words, I think theoretical knowledge, and if we have only one kind of theoretical knowledge, we'll have one way of looking at the world. But if we have multiple theories or paradigms that you are introduced to, it means that you know that there could be another way of understanding our surroundings. And of course, contextual knowledge is important. It does not make sense to say that what works in Bangalore today works for Delhi, or what works in New York works for London, or what works somewhere else works across, right? So a tendency to universalize, especially when we are in the realm of policy making, has to be resisted. So let me just now make some concluding points. Theories, the way in which I've put them here, is they are fundamentally contending in nature. Contending means that it is very difficult to synthesize them and to put them together because they're truly opposing in nature. And that is fine. In terms of marginalist economics, now you can come with similar policy conclusions in marginalist economics by saying that there are some kind of imperfections. So you can talk about labor market imperfections and say that because of this kind of imperfections, you need to have more active minimum wage policy. So if you're thinking that if you do marginalist economics, you cannot arrive at a similar policy conclusion, that is not true. You can. But my claim is that these imperfections are more ad hoc, or another probably better way of putting it is that these imperfections will then depend on your own politics or your own ethical standpoint. In terms of empirics, this I haven't really spoken about, or I haven't, but I thought it's important to mention this when I'm talking about pluralism, which is that it's not pluralism only in theories, but even in the empirical realm, you have descriptive statistics. And now, what is more famous is some kind of causal inference or experimental methods like RCT. But there are also other methods like ethnography, or more descriptive statistics or more qualitative work. We should also have a pluralism in our empirical vision. At some points in time, some of these methods will be fashionable, will be popular, but that does not mean that they are necessarily the best method. The nature of data collection is something I feel we need to pay more attention to, especially because of the rapid advances in technology. How is data collected? And this is a point that I sometimes think about, which is that we make this distinction of data and oral history, or what people are saying. But in a way, if you look at least survey data, a lot of survey data, first people are talking, right? People are remembering. It depends on people's emotions. People are recollecting. People are then responding to your questions, right? So this supposed significant distinction between quantitative data and qualitative data can be challenged. and we need to pay more attention to the sources. And what kind of data is collected often depends on what kind of theory that you're exposed to, or what kind of politics or other kinds of interests you have. What is the role of textbooks? Uh, and I think that this is an important thing. And by definition, textbooks suggest some kind of authority. But it is important to remember that textbooks, whether it's written by someone else or me or anyone for that matter, they give a particular perspective of the author. Right? So, and as students or as teachers, I think that we need to critically engage with that perspective, because your perspective could be different from that. And this, what I want to note here is in microeconomics textbook particularly, they make this distinction between positive economics and normative economics, or what is questions and what ought to be questions. But truly speaking, given the nature of economics, this distinction is very difficult to make. Let me just sort of pose a kind of thought experiment how to, at least the way I'm thinking about this, is that the policies of yesterday determine the, um, the events of today. So what people thought in the past should be, or should be the way of economic organization, is what we see today. Right? So the way in which ideas and facts, or ideas, theories, viewpoints, what happens in reality, they are all very intertwined when it comes to economics. And this neat separation between the two, I think, also needs to be resisted. Well, I think that given the kind of advances that we are making in technology, and the empirical, the importance given to econometrics and quantitative data, there is also a lot of overload or of information. And I think that it is important in this context also to have a good grasp of multiple approaches within economics, especially in economic theory, to make sense of this overload. And just to repeat, I think all our understanding is based on our notion, our whatever concepts that we have learned, concepts, categories, theories, ideas, perspectives, and our context, right, which is what we see around us. So, what is lived experience is also important, and we should be open to engaging with lived experience as well as with abstract concepts. And how do we bring them in a classroom or outside the classroom in university spaces? I think it's extremely important not to shun any kind of, it's easy to say that, oh, this is just your experience. But I don't think we should do that. Or it's also easy to say that this is abstract, so it doesn't work for us. Right? So I think both need to be brought together. And finally, I'll just make a note on critical pedagogy. What I really mean is, the mode in which we are questioning, where are these ideas coming from? Where are these textbooks coming from? All of these things need to be questioned and needs to be engaged with, especially as students who are who are now in your undergraduation or post-graduation. I think that it's important to have that critical engagement constantly. So now let me just give you, some books, and then I'll end with some of the questions that I have. So if you're interested in understanding India's statistical system and how data is collected, which are the government agencies that are involved in it, or the point about how data comes to be as they are, Measuring India is a good book. If you're interested at a much more introductory level to understand how, especially in the Indian context, petty production, informal labor, agriculture, Omkarnath's book is a good introduction. The book that I've been working on, it's over, but I hope it will be out in May, hopefully. Where what I've tried to do in this book is something similar to what I've done in this presentation or this lecture, which is I've tried to put forth these contending theories within the Indian context and try to introduce the reader to macroeconomics. If you're more interested in history of economic thought or much detail, you can look at Alessandro Roncaglia's book. Now, Adam Smith is a sort of a difficult figure, difficult also because people both in the right and left of the spectrum say that, Adam Smith belongs to them. But if you want to have a much more thorough and detailed engagement of Adam Smith's writing. You can look at The Science of Wealth by Tony Aspromorgos. Antonella Pichio writes, or her book Social Reproduction is written within the classical tradition. So if you're interested in the questions of labor market or the political economy of the labor market, this is a book that you can look at. Finally, so let me just, probably I'm ending not on such a positive tone, but there is a positive spirit in which I'm, raising these questions. And the question is, are we seeing some kind of a conceptual regress, right? Or is there a degeneration in a way? And what do I mean by that? So and I'm not going to respond to these things. If you have a response in the Q&A, then I might respond to it, but I'm not going to answer the question. Is the notion of intertemporal equilibrium actually an advance over the earlier notion of long period equilibrium or long run equilibrium? Is our notion of marginal utility actually an advance, or is it a regress? Is our understanding of preferences, isolated preferences and demand, again, a conceptual regress from, let's say, Adam Smith's notion of effectual demand? Is our understanding that price is determined by supply and demand some kind of a conceptual regress? Let's say, I'm going back in time to Thomas Aquinas, who had this notion of just price. Is our understanding of wage as being determined by the marginal product of labor some kind of a conceptual regress when we compare it with the much more richer explanations that are found in classical political economy? So I'll end there, and thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. You might want to take up some questions, the question in the questions tab, and a couple of questions which were there in the chat box earlier regarding different schools of thought. Yeah.
So let me just look at the Q&A first. Okay, so I'll just read out the question. The question is, I want to know about the scope and opportunities of classical political economy in modern time. In terms of research. So this is a bit of a difficult question to answer, but let me just try to put it. One way to understand research is to think of it as trying to make sense of our surroundings. Now, if you think the classical political economy is able to help you understand your economic surroundings better, I would suggest that you should pursue it. But then with all these kinds of advice, there is also another thing that we need to also look at the job market, because ultimately we need to find a job. But I think in the Indian job market, I think that there is ample scope for working on classical political economy or political economy and still being able to find a job in the university setting. But that is about, let's say, the university kind of, if you are interested in a university job. But what is classical political economy ultimately providing us? It's providing us with an analytical framework, which has a particular ethic, which has a particular philosophy. There are empirical studies there. You can do econometrics there. You can do further studies. You can study the Indian economy through that lens. You can study agricultural economics through that lens, like Krishna Bharadwaj has done. So the possibility of exploring any topic that you're interested in still exists. And so I think that in a way, there is ample scope and opportunities too. Now let me just, okay. So the question is, one of the questions that have come up is, what about the other pluralistic economic theories of thought under development, Austrian school, institutional economics, ecological, evolutionary, you can bring in feminist economics, where do they stand? So Austrian economics has a different theory of value, but I would place them closer to the subjective theory of value. Institutional economics So institutional economics so with institutional economics, ecological and evolutionary economics, or the question that what the reason I didn't bring them up is because they're talking about specific aspects of the economy. And my question would, or my response to your question would be, do they have a different theory of value? Or in ecological economics, do you find people who adopt marginalist economics, people who adopt Marxian economics, people who adopt feminist economics together? Similarly, within feminist economics, do you find that there are people from marginalist economics, there are people from classical political economy, there are people from Marxian, there are people from Austrian economics, right? So when it comes to subfields like ecological economics, evolutionary economics, institutional economics, it's a bit difficult to uh, classify them on the basis that I have classified, which is the theory of value, because practitioners in these areas often come from multiple paradigms. So, in other words, you can be a mainstream economist and still do institutional economics. You can be a heterodox economist and still do institutional economics.
Thank you so much, sir. If there are any more questions, I think we can wait for a minute or two. In case there are any more questions, please feel free to post them in the chat box or in the questions tab.
Okay, some question has, I think, come up in the Q&A tab. Let me just look at that. In every 20, 25 years, the world is dealing with some sort of recession. So is there any alternative or sort of ideas available in order to counter that recession if we follow heterodox economics? That's the first question. I think that at least classical political economy offers a better way of understanding our economic surroundings than marginalist economics. But having said that, there is a big gap, or there's a big long path between theories and policies. So it's not straightforward that a particular explanation can directly be applied and to your actual surroundings. Right? So, in a way, academics have a better sense of the role of theories and the role of empirics, but in terms of policy making and what can be done, is I think is of a different kind. And I don't know enough about it, but if you're interested in, for instance, what do policymakers do, what are the kind of policy tools that are available to them, let's say for instance NREGA, or there are various kinds of government schemes, what can be done at that level? But ultimately there is some kind of a role in which ideas have a power, because for instance, let's talk of the FRBM Act. Where is the idea behind the FRBM Act coming from? It's coming from some notion of marginalist economics, some notion of scarcity, right? So I think that we need alternative, we need multiple ideas, and we need to challenge dominant ideas, because then we have at least more alternatives, we have more pathways to think about a particular problem. The second question is, in nowadays, the alternative approach is delivered to students only in few higher education institutions, and mainly all the higher institutions are dealing with neoclassical. Then what is the problem? Yeah, so the question is what can be done. One is, I think, of course, it's difficult to change the syllabi just like that. But I think that as what Rethinking Economics is doing, even without the online platform, you can always come together, go to the library, take up texts that you want to read, share your lived experiences, bring them to the classroom, bring them to the discussions, and try to engage. Because I think now, if you have some kind of access to the internet, there are a lot of resources available too. Okay. The next question is, classical political economy essentially describes an advanced capitalist economy. So where do we place the understanding of economics of developing countries in this approach? Yeah. So this, Actually, I didn't clarify, but when I was speaking about all these theories, I'm talking about a competitive economy, and we're talking in an abstract sense about what theories operate there. And as I responded previously, what classical political economy or marginalist economics does is to provide a perspective, a standpoint, a sort of coherent perspective to understand the surroundings. From there to reaching to our contemporary context, there are a lot of steps because, for instance, I mean, the classic, I mean, one easy example to provide is competition assumes labor mobility. But in the Indian context, we know that labor is not mobile because of patriarchy, because of caste system. So automatically, I mean, the assumption of labor mobility is challenged. So we need to bring in which is what I mentioned, that you have conceptual information categories which is provided by classical political economy, but then we have to enrich it with contextual information. Inflation and the marginalist approach, again, mostly earlier at least it was more clear that they were following some kind of a monetarist approach. Now most central banks seem to follow some kind of a new Keynesian approach, or which adopts the Phillips curve. Again, the Phillips curve notion can be questioned, and people have tried to do that. And there is also an additional question to think about, which is, if in India food inflation is central, what can monetary policy do, or monetary policy alone do, to alleviate food inflation? Or if inflation is because of increase in crude oil prices, what can we do? So should inflation be only a concern of monetary policy? That is the question or the response. Unemployment is a persistent issue. How far is it a political issue? See, in a way, I would respond by saying that all economic issues are political issues. Because fundamentally, economics is talking about and trying to explain material resources and our access to them. And in that sense, it means that we have some idea of what should be the case, what we want it to be for maybe our community, our children, our region, our country. So in that sense, I think that, it is certainly a political issue. Yeah, so there is a question here about, can there be any demerits of pluralism? But maybe I don't want to respond yet, but can you just maybe tell me why you thought that way, why you felt that way, and then I'll respond. Okay, so I think you've responded that. We don't know exactly from where to start and in what extent we read a particular material. So for instance, I mean, if you are interested in, I mean, I think there is enough material which introduces you to pluralistic approach and talks about the differences. As I said, so The Wealth of Ideas by Alessandro Roncaglia is a good book because it also talks about the evolution of economic thought, but it also makes a distinction between different schools of thought. It's a big book, but he has also written a shorter book, a sort of concise book of that. So you can read that, and I think then you will have a better sense of it. And maybe I often say this to students in class, that sometimes we feel confused. Not sometimes, many a times we feel confused. But in the quest for learning or the quest for knowledge, being in a confused state, temporarily at least, is not a bad thing. Because we are trying to read a little bit of this, we are trying to read a little bit of that, then somebody else tells that something else has happened. We are bound to be confused. But the thing is, if you have a community of people who you can discuss these ideas, and slowly, I think that some sort of clarity will emerge. So I'm not saying that everything becomes crystal clear automatically. But it might take time. But I think that it's possible to arrive at some sort of a clear position. So as I said, maybe when I was doing my masters and bachelors, constantly there was a sense of maybe not understanding fully, but we had people we could ask questions to and get some response, because people who have thought about these ideas for longer than I had at that time. And in some other contexts, we didn't have people. So it meant that we had to go to the library, read up. And it was a slow process. And it is a slow process, I think, sometimes.
So I think that's pretty much all the questions. Sir, is it all right if we end the session now?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you with us. We hope all of you who attended the session found value and enjoyed it. I'm a part of the growth team of Rethinking Economics India Network, and we are looking for leaders who wish to take this forward. If you enjoyed this workshop and want to engage further with us, or want to hold such workshops and events in your colleges, or bring new economic thinking to your colleges, please feel free to reach out to us at india@rethinkeconomics.org, or use any of the links that we have mentioned in the chat box below. Also, Dr. Alex Thomas's book is coming out this April, so please watch out for it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session. We hope you have a great weekend ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Srishti, Vinayakan, and Amrita and others for having me here. Yeah, thank you.